The money that quietly vanished from your wallet this morning is not just the result of simple inflation. As we watch the cost of living endlessly skyrocket, we often blame incompetent politicians or greedy corporations. But the truth is much colder and far more massive. This suffocating inflation you experience every single day is, in fact, an imperial defense fee, one that the entire global population of 8 billion has been secretly paying for the last 50 years. In other words, it is the most perfectly designed mandatory tax in the history of capitalism. Let me ask you a question. If the United States is simply printing paper money to exploit the world, then why on earth have the world's most brilliant economists and proudest developed nations submitted to this unfair system without a single word of complaint for half a century? Today, I am going to completely shatter the outdated economic common sense you've believed to be true your entire life. I will ruthlessly dissect the reality of a highly engineered, multidimensional financial business, not just the logic of power. Do not look away for even a single second. The truth is sometimes chilling enough to betray everything we believe in. Let's thoroughly analyze the shallow stereotypes surrounding the massive power of the reserve currency enjoyed by the United States, often thought of merely as the exorbitant privilege of easily printing paper money to monopolize economic benefits. Let's turn the clock back to August 1971 and watch the sight of U.S. President Richard Nixon's shocking television announcement. At the time, the U.S. was bogged down in the endless quagmire of the Vietnam War, pouring in astronomical war funds, and the gold in the national treasury was fiercely draining to Europe due to a massive trade deficit. Eventually, Nixon makes a momentous declaration to the whole world. From now on, even if you bring US dollar bills, we will no longer exchange them for real gold. This historic event is exactly the famous Nixon shock. It was the moment the golden chain that had continued since the 1944 Bretton Woods system was broken. Now, the US dollar had completely lost its reliable physical backing of gold, its intrinsic value. It had plummeted into a mere piece of paper, where the government guarantees value with ink on paper. In other words, fiat money. At that time, numerous global economic scholars and financial experts unanimously and firmly prophesied. Now, the era of the paper dollar, having lost the guarantee of gold, will fade into history. To make matters worse, that ominous prophecy seemed to immediately become reality. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, broke out in the Middle East. As Arab oil-producing countries, furious at Western nations supporting Israel, implemented an oil embargo, international oil prices skyrocketed by a staggering 4 times in a short period. This is the first oil shock that drove the entire world into the fear of stagflation. The U.S. economy endlessly plummeted, and the dollar's prestige hit rock bottom. But the true capability of the modern financial empire shines exactly in this desperate crisis. The U.S. transforms this unprecedented bankruptcy crisis into a geopolitical opportunity to elevate their global hegemony to an entirely new dimension. While conspiratorial views describe this as an evil American plot for world domination, looking at the cold, hard facts, it was the most fierce and sophisticated business strategy for the national survival of a U.S. that was on the brink of collapse at the time. In July 1974, when the whole country was staggering from inflation, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon boarded a plane and flew in absolute secrecy to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And there, he forged the most decisive economic secret pact in human history. The core of the negotiation was a strict exchange of interests. In exchange for the U.S. permanently guaranteeing the maintenance and safety of the Saudi royal regime and providing a security umbrella of state-of-the-art military weapons, Saudi Arabia had to unify the payment for all the crude oil it exported to the world into only US dollars. When Saudi Arabia accepted this proposal, the dynamics of the global economy were completely flipped. Let me use an analogy so easy that an elementary schooler could understand. For modern industrial nations, oil is like blood that must be transfused every day to run cars and operate factories. But the only voucher that could buy that blood was designated as the dollar. Now, a coercive demand was created where all countries around the world had to export desperately, by any means necessary, just to survive, in order to unconditionally earn US dollars and stack them in their central bank vaults. But the most sophisticated mechanism of financial business, the recycling of capital, occurs. The astronomical petrodollars Saudi Arabia earned by selling oil. If this money was just left sitting in a vault, its value would melt away due to global inflation. At this time, the US presents a very attractive investment destination. It was the strongest and safest asset that paid regular interest: US Treasury bonds. Because anti-American sentiment in the Arab world was at its peak right after the war with Israel, Saudi Arabia was terrified that the world would find out their oil money was helping the US fiscal deficit. Catching on to this, the US Treasury Department established a private special bidding system called Add-on for strict secrecy. They accommodated the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority so they could quietly buy massive amounts of national bonds without going through a public bid. They even perfectly concealed this massive return of capital for a long period of 41 years by not separately disclosing Saudi Arabia's holdings in official statistics, but rather lumping them together as an oil-producing group of 14 countries. As a result, by 1977, Saudi Arabia had seized a whopping 20% of all US Treasury bonds held by foreigners. The person who put the decisive finishing touch on this was US Fed Chair Paul Volcker in 1979. He skyrocketed the benchmark interest rate to an unprecedented level of 20%, claiming he would tame the killer inflation. This brutal high interest rate policy brought massive unemployment and economic recession within the US, but from the perspective of global capital movement, it was a masterstroke. The US Treasury bond, which had been nothing more than a piece of paper, was brilliantly upgraded into a modern-day gold bar that guaranteed the safest and overwhelmingly highest real yield in the world. Overflowing surplus capital from all over the world was sucked into US Wall Street like a black hole to claim this high interest. The US had perfected a flawless horn of plenty where, no matter how much debt they took on and how much they grew their fiscal deficit, the whole world rushed to buy that debt for them. This is also the reason why Germany and Japan, who were running massive trade surpluses during the 1985 Plaza Accord, submitted without a word to the US's unreasonable demands for currency appreciation. In the face of the geopolitical threat of the Soviet Union, they desperately needed the public goods of the maritime trade routes protected by the US Navy and the nuclear umbrella. In exchange for being guaranteed that security, they silently paid a voluntary and dedicated security tax by never converting their dollars to gold to the very end, and instead purchasing US Treasury bonds. But for everyone, behind the beautiful balance of the macroeconomy we learned in textbooks, lies a much colder and more meticulous true structure of business. Did the cycle of the petrodollar I just explained sound merely like a peaceful story of public goods, where crude oil and national bonds safely go back and forth while the US Navy guards the sea routes? When you peel off the outer layer of the exchange between economy and security one by one, a multidimensional control network of power appears, one that is difficult to capture through the eyes of the ordinary public. Modern international political scientists call this highly precise system weaponized interdependence. It is a chilling insight that in the era of networks tightly connected as one due to globalization, the country holding the central hub of that network can hold the economic life or death power over other nations without firing a single gun or cannon. The first cog in this weaponized network is SWIFT, which controls the movement pathways of global capital. SWIFT is an international interbank telecommunication agreement established in Belgium in 1973 by European and American banks to process complex cross-border remittances quickly and accurately. In its early days of establishment, this system was nothing more than a pure technological innovation and a politically neutral financial cooperative. It means it was not an evil trap created by the US from the very beginning to spy on the world's money lines, as some conspiracy theories suggest. However, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001 that changed the course of history, this transparent communication network began to evolve into a powerful weapon of financial sanctions under the overwhelming logic of national security. Under the pretext of tracking and preemptively blocking the black money of terrorists, the US government activates the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, or TFTP. The US Treasury Department issued legal subpoenas and secured a massive amount of international remittance data, amounting to millions of transactions, flowing across the SWIFT network. The US authorities became able to clearly see exactly which company on the other side of the globe was sending exactly how much money to which country's bank. To use an analogy an elementary schooler could easily understand, it is like the US taking over the world's largest post office logistics center, where billions of letters pass through every day, and building a system that scans the addresses of every single sender and recipient. This went beyond simply spying on information. It handed the US an omnipotent asymmetry of information to perfectly detect any attempts to bypass US economic sanctions in advance. If this massive information network is the surveillance camera, the actual judicial guillotine linked to that camera, capable of severing a financial lifeline at any moment, is the second trap, the CHIPS settlement network. After banks around the world exchange messages saying, "Send the money," through the SWIFT network, the final settlement process, where the ownership of those massive dollars is actually transferred and cleared, must unconditionally pass through a computer network called CHIPS, operated by the New York Clearinghouse Association and the ledgers of the US Central Bank. A structural limitation where over 90% of the world's dollar transactions must pass through this incredibly narrow bottleneck in New York. The US utilized this overwhelming bottleneck point to expand their extraterritorial judicial jurisdiction across the entire globe. The case of BNP Paribas, France's largest commercial bank, which occurred in 2014, is a decisive example showing how ruthlessly this judicial guillotine operates. BNP Paribas was a French bank, and it had not clearly violated domestic or international law. However, the remittance amounts of this bank's clients were connected to countries like Sudan or Iran, which the US government was independently applying economic sanctions against at the time. The problem was that during the process of the funds passing through multiple networks, for just a single second, a very brief moment, it brushed through the US CHIPS computer network located in New York. Based on this fleeting moment, the US Justice Department applied a powerful legal standard known as flying the dollar flag, stipulating, because you used the US computer network, this is clearly a major crime that occurred within US territory. And they brought down an astronomical financial hammer on this giant French bank, imposing a fine of a staggering $8.97 billion, an unprecedented amount in financial history. Even for a bank boasting the #1 size in the world, if it offends the US and is kicked out of this dollar settlement network, all its international financial operations are paralyzed that very day, making immediate bankruptcy unavoidable. The financial institutions of the world, having clearly witnessed the $8.97 billion fine with their own eyes, were gripped by massive fear. As a result, global banks adopted an over-regulation policy where they would voluntarily cut off transactions altogether if there was even the slightest room for friction with the US Treasury Department, even if the transaction was perfectly legal under their own domestic laws. Without firing a single shot, the U.S. turned the banks of the whole world into private sheriffs, executing their foreign policy without pay. The third core structure to examine is the invisible chain of debt that plunged the global economy into a chronic dollar thirst, the euro-dollar market. The public often thinks that only the dollars within the U.S. mainland are real dollars. But the truly terrifying liquidity that controls the world lies in the massive credit currency created in offshore seas like London or the Bahamas, completely outside the strict regulations of the U.S. Federal Reserve. The surplus dollars of oil-producing countries pouring out due to the oil shocks in the 1970s flocked to this unregulated euro-dollar market, printing infinite loans and derivatives. Countless emerging country governments and corporations borrowed these cheap offshore dollars to build factories and conduct trade. Financial analyst Brent Johnson clearly explains the fatal structural flaw caused by this phenomenon with his dollar milkshake theory. When the global economy is cruising smoothly, emerging markets enjoy the party, pulling in cheap interest dollar debt. But if the U.S. Federal Reserve suddenly hikes the benchmark interest rate due to inflationary pressures, the situation flips 180 degrees. Liquid capital scattered around the world is fiercely sucked into the U.S. Treasury bond market in search of safety and higher interest, just like a giant straw sucking up a milkshake. Emerging nations, drained of dollar funds like an ebbing tide, suffer from extreme dollar droughts as they try to pay off their dollar-denominated foreign debt that has just reached maturity. They face a massive short squeeze phenomenon where they must frantically sweep up whatever dollars are left in the market to avoid sovereign default. No matter how much a country politically criticizes the U.S. and cries out for de-dollarization, a perfect structural trap has been completed. In order to prevent the worst-case scenario of immediate national default, they must hoard U.S. dollars by any means necessary, even if exchange rates skyrocket. This massive chain of debt is the absolute core of the ruthless structural power that forcibly restricts the choices of other nations' economic actors. The fourth part we need to address is the raw business reality of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF bailouts, which we commonly recognize only as a savior during economic crises. Think back to the horrifying third world debt crisis that struck Latin America and Africa following Paul Volcker's high interest rate policy in the 1980s. At the desperate moment when moratorium declarations were lining up, the IMF appeared as a firefighter and handed out emergency loans. But if we trace the movement path of those funds through the eyes of a cold-hearted business analyst, those massive dollar loans were not used to revive the collapsed domestic economies of the debtor nation's citizens. Those funds were primarily injected to recover the existing bonds that were on the verge of being defaulted on by the giant Western commercial banks of Wall Street and London, who had recklessly handed out loans to developing countries. In other words, its true nature was a lifeboat rescuing the Western financial system from the brink of collapse. The truly heavy and painful result lies in the harsh, structural adjustment programs forced upon them in exchange for the loans. Austerity measures and the privatization of public enterprises were a given, but they also forcibly overhauled the very economic constitution of developing countries into an export-oriented one. Instead of fostering domestic industries for self-reliance, they were forced to pour all of the nation's capabilities strictly into producing cash crops like coffee or sugar, or low-wage, simple assembly manufactured goods, which could be sold only to the Western world to earn dollars. Rather than an evil conspiracy to turn emerging nations into eternal debt slaves, this structural adjustment was an extremely ruthless logic of capital designed to incorporate them into the very bottom infrastructure of the global supply chain, ensuring the smooth recovery of Western financial capital's profits. But as a result, the Global South had to suffer a lost decade incapable of self-reliance, suffering from a chronic dollar shortage, trapped in a perpetual hamster wheel, where they somehow had to earn dollars just to pay back Western debt again. The final point to note is the fact that all of this financial and structural power network is by no means floating in thin air. At its foundation exists the overwhelming military force of the US Navy, which perfectly controls 90% of the world's physical maritime trade routes. Some economists and geopolitical analysts sharply analyze that the tragic ends met by Saddam Hussein of Iraq when he tried to completely replace crude oil export payments with the euro, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya when he advocated for an independent, gold-backed African currency, were absolutely not unrelated to their frontal challenges to dollar hegemony. While we cannot define this as a definitive conspiratorial truth, the historical pattern where their countries were immediately and forcibly returned to the dollar settlement system right after their regimes were overthrown is a cold, undeniable fact. This acted as the most powerful global deterrent, visually burning into the minds of other oil-producing or emerging nations just how horrifying the geopolitical risks would be if they tried to break away from the dollar ecosystem. So far, we have broken the old frame of capitalist economics and dissected the multidimensional power structure of the dollar system that has dominated the global economy for 50 years, looking through the lens of a cold-headed business analyst. The petrodollar system was not simply a superficial commercial contract to pay for Middle Eastern oil only in dollars. The massive liquidity black hole of national bond recycling that fills infinite fiscal deficits. SWIFT, the omnipotent information control network that identifies every single flow of global funds. CHIPS, the extraterritorial judicial power that controls banks worldwide by imposing trillions in fines without allowing even a second of transgression. The structural short squeeze of the eurodollar that absorbs the wealth of emerging nations worldwide with a single interest rate hike. The structural adjustment programs that incorporated emerging nations into the very bottom of the global supply chain in exchange for bailouts. And the US Navy's command of the sea that guards all this infrastructure with overwhelming military force. These 6 massive core pillars interlock seamlessly like a single precision cogwheel, the crystallization of a structural power meticulously designed so that no country can easily escape. This is the heavy, bare face of the monetary system of the past half-century that we have maintained while paying the tax called inflation in our daily lives. Many of us living in modern capitalism have maintained a precarious balance while enjoying the benefits of relatively stable global trade, under the protective shield of the massive economic greenhouse created by this solid power structure. But everyone, just because you finally clearly understand the operating principles of this system now, you must absolutely not turn off this video feeling relieved. Because right now, at the very deepest core of this fortress-like financial machine that has run flawlessly without a single fatal error for half a century, the most fundamental and threatening seismic tremors of collapse in the history of capitalism are being loudly detected. Why is Saudi Arabia, believed to be America's eternal security blood brother, starting to open its heart to the yuan or other currency settlements right at this specific time, breaking the 50-year sanctuary taboo of the exclusive dollar payment? How will the flow of global capital fluctuate if the BRICS nations, feeling extreme economic and security threats from the weaponized dollar guillotine, fully activate their own independent settlement networks to replace SWIFT and begin to collectively break away from this system? Conversely, what will happen if the United States itself, unable to bear the burden of its snowballing massive trade deficit and debt, declares that it will no longer bear the role of the world's policeman and consumer market? The massive breakwater of the reserve currency that securely protected your tight bank accounts and precious retirement funds for half a century is right now cracking and splitting in multiple directions with a deafening roar right before our eyes. It is time to seriously prepare for exactly what kind of horrifying, massive butterfly effect these seemingly microscopic cracks will ultimately bring to your everyday grocery receipt prices and your stock accounts. In the upcoming Part 3 video, we will ruthlessly dig into the specific, fatal collapse signal data of the seemingly eternal fortress of dollar hegemony and the massive restructuring era of new wealth that is fiercely shaking at the bottom of the global economy as a result. If you absolutely do not want to miss the final survival compass that will protect your blood-like assets and turn the coming crisis into an opportunity for new wealth, you must hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now and thoroughly prepare for the approaching massive financial typhoon.